In the office of the British Prime Minister, the phone rang. It was a secure line, meaning no one would disturb it without good reason. When the Prime Minister picked up the receiver, a phrase she knew well but hoped never to hear came through: "London Bridge is down." In an instant, the entire country was plunged into mourning. Soon, the news was being discussed worldwide. On September 8th, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II of the House of Windsor passed away at the age of 96. An old era came to an end, and the world was forever changed. You might think, what cheap pathos? It's clear that words like dynasty, monarchy, and throne sound archaic in the 20th century. Obviously, kings no longer hold the power they once did, and the royal court is more like a costume spectacle with aristocrats as the main actors. But if that's the case, why did nearly 1 billion people watch footage of Princess Diana's wedding, and almost 3 billion tune in for her funeral? Why do the fates of her children, William and Harry, their wives, scandals, and candid interviews captivate people from India to Australia, from Vancouver to Tokyo? If everyone supposedly stopped caring about the British monarchy long ago, why does it still command so much attention across the globe? When did the Windsors, once a dynasty of global significance, turn into reality show stars? Where did it all go wrong, and what was the reality behind it all? You're watching an episode about the British monarchy and the still reigning House of Windsor. If you enjoyed our series on the Bourbons, Habsburgs, and others, this video won't leave you indifferent. We're embarking on a grand historical journey from King Edward VIII to Charles III. It's got everything: dynastic twists, betrayals, political and romantic intrigues, all set against the backdrop of the 20th century's historical tragedies and the collapse of the greatest empire of the old world. In this episode, you'll learn who in the royal family was suspected of being linked to Jack the Ripper's murders, how some Windsors chose love while others chased political power and wealth. We won't forget Princess Diana of Wales either, and we'll explain how her arrival shook the ruling family. You're on a channel where interesting stories aren't just told, they're explained. This episode, as you might guess, is dedicated to Britain. But don't worry, we won't dig all the way back to King Arthur or, heaven forbid, to the city of Londinium in the Roman Empire. We'll focus mainly on the 20th century. Let's unfold the map. We're in 19th century Europe, specifically the 1830s. In Russia, Nicholas I is firmly seated on the throne. Russia, like the rest of Europe, has recovered from the Napoleonic Wars, but the system established by the Congress of Vienna in 1815 is starting to crack. In France, the Bourbon dynasty is overthrown by their more liberal cousins, the House of Orleans. The recently formed Austrian Empire is still ruled by the Habsburgs. In Spain, the First Carlist War rages. The United States is eyeing the Wild West and preparing to wage war with Mexico over California. It's not yet a war of all against all, as Hobbes might describe, but it's getting close. In those years, Russia was de facto the continent's leading power, the liberator of Europe from the French. Its main counterweight was Britain, with its vast possessions and interests across the globe, in India, East Asia, America, and Africa. But despite the dazzling brilliance of the British crown, the throne was shaky. For nearly 60 years, the country was ruled by George III of the House of Hanover. Usually, when someone holds power for so long, they're later called great. That's definitely not the case with George. First, he lost the American colonies, leading to the independence of the United States. Second, he constantly battled Parliament for power, and not very successfully. For those 60 years, especially toward the end, he was physically and mentally ill. By the end, he was completely blind. His wife feared sleeping in the same bed with him, worried he might kill her in a fit of madness. He could throw his own son against a wall, scream profanities, or, in a manic episode, talk for hours on end, demanding to be heard. It's hard to say which was worse. When the king was only nominally in power, others ruled the country. But his granddaughter, Queen Victoria, truly became the greatest queen in the nation's history. She was just 18 when she ascended the throne. Originally named Alexandrina, after our Alexander I, she was raised with extreme strictness, constantly watched, punished for the slightest misstep. The princess didn't even have her own bedroom. Even as a teenager, she slept in the same room as her mother. This wasn't about a lack of baby monitors. Everyone knew Victoria could become the next ruler, hence the total control. From an early age, her family decided she would marry her cousin from Germany, Prince Albert of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But despite this gilded cage, Victoria refused to be a puppet. She was mature and independent beyond her years, taking it upon herself to understand the country's affairs. She decided to give the German her family had chosen for her a chance. And a miracle happened. After their first meeting, Victoria fell head over heels for Albert. She wrote that he was incredibly handsome, with large blue eyes, a beautiful nose, and a charming mouth with perfect teeth. 3 days after their first meeting, she proposed to him. This wasn't female emancipation. Protocol dictated that the monarch couldn't be proposed to. The queen had to make the offer herself. And you know what? It was a happy marriage. Perhaps Albert didn't love his powerful wife to the point of obsession, but he deeply respected her. Their relationship was built on genuine friendship and trust. The only thing that irritated Victoria was her new in-laws. They wanted British money to cover the debts of the king in Albert's homeland, Coburg. Wait a minute, so the British king was a German? How did British subjects and aristocrats feel about that? Well, let's not rush to conclusions. Remember the dynasty before Victoria? The Hanovers. They were also Germans, and the British had long grown accustomed to it, even as nationalism was rising across Europe. In the comments to any of our episodes mentioning the Romanovs, you'll find emotional remarks like, "Don't call them Romanovs, they're Holstein-Gottorps." This isn't about analyzing the essence of the Romanovs' rule, but about using a foreign-sounding surname to suggest they were alien to Russian soil because of their German blood. End of discussion. But let's look at other ruling dynasties of the time. In Britain, as we've established, Germans ruled. In the Netherlands, the House of Orange had zero Dutch blood. In Spain and southern Italy, the French Bourbons reigned. Sweden's rulers were descendants of a French marshal. In neighboring Denmark, Germans held sway. And the fact that Nicholas I's mother was named Sophie Marie Dorothea Augusta Louise of Württemberg, his maternal grandmother was Frederica Dorothea Sophia of Brandenburg-Schwedt, and his paternal grandmother was Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt. I nearly died pronouncing all that. Well, the German roots of the Romanovs were part of a European trend, not an anomaly. Bismarck once joked that Germany had become Europe's tribal farm, and the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, where Victoria's husband came from, was one of the most successful players in that farm. From our videos, you know that the Habsburgs were once the masters of strategic marriages, but in the 19th century, that title passed to the Saxe-Coburgs. It was said they achieved more in the bedroom than Charlemagne and Napoleon did on the battlefield. Odd as it sounds, by the start of World War I, all the monarchs of Europe's empires were related to each other. From this perspective, the First World War could be seen as a domestic family feud. Perhaps that's why they tore into each other with such ferocity. But back to Queen Victoria. Her marriage wasn't just happy, it was fruitful, producing 9 children. Albert adored his children and spent a lot of time with them. What else was there to do when things were calm at home, and he had no claim to the British crown while his wife was alive? Today, a father staying home with the kids is considered progressive, but some could afford it even in the 19th century. Albert and Victoria's relationship became a model: strict upbringing, mutual respect, no lovers or mistresses. Their strong marriage became a symbol of the Victorian era. Albert loved all his children, but doted a bit more on his eldest son, the heir to the throne, Albert Edward. And it was this overbearing care that ultimately ruined him. Some children become hostages to their parents' lofty expectations. Albert Edward, known in the family as Bertie, was expected to achieve greatness. His father spent endless hours with him, taking him on walks and involving him in official matters, but something went wrong from the start. Even as a child, Bertie was utterly uncontrollable. The best teachers in Britain couldn't manage him. He didn't care about studying, thought it normal to stand up during lessons and start shouting, and there were even instances of him throwing stones at his teachers. Not exactly ideal traits for a future king. Things didn't improve with age. Bertie inherited his father's striking looks, a blessing and a burden he couldn't handle. At Oxford and Cambridge, he didn't study but chased women, got drunk and gambled from morning to night. Albert realized the situation needed drastic change. He tried to instill in Bertie, "Son, the future king of Britain can't behave like this. You must be a symbol of power, not the hero of gossip and sordid rumors." As you can guess, the lectures didn't help. So, the parents resorted to a time-tested method. They sent Bertie to the army. He was lucky, no distant campaigns in India or drill service in South Africa, just a military training course in nearby Ireland. Victoria and Albert hoped this would at least teach the young prince discipline. The result? If not negative, then certainly zero. At some point, it came out that an actress was living with him in his campaign tent. Can you imagine the shame for his royal parents? For 20 years, they'd built an image of a puritanical family, and here was their son spitting on Victorian morals and everything else, pulling stunts like this. His mother tried writing him letters, but it was no use. So, in early December, his father traveled to Cambridge to confront Bertie and set him straight. They had a long talk, sometimes loud, sometimes calm, but Albert saw his son was unchanged. The fateful conversation took place in pouring rain. Albert caught a cold, and 2 weeks later, he died. He was only 42. This was a devastating blow for Victoria. Over 20 years, their bond had only grown stronger. She called him her angel. After his death, the Queen entered a period of indefinite mourning. For 5 years, she didn't deliver the speech from the throne to Parliament. In other words, she publicly showed she couldn't fulfill her duties. Every night, she placed a portrait of her late husband on the pillow beside her and fell asleep hugging his nightshirt. Now imagine what Victoria thought of the wayward son who, however indirectly, was linked to her beloved husband's death. She quietly despised him for the next 40 years of her life. Until her death, she refused to meet him one-on-one. Naturally, there was no talk of passing the throne early or raising a worthy heir to the dynasty. To solve the problem of the prince's escapades, the Queen urgently began searching for a wife for him, deliberately not consulting him. Why bother? The choice fell on Danish Princess Alexandra, cheerful, kind, and as extroverted as Bertie. If she reminds you of Nicholas II's wife, don't be surprised. They were indeed relatives. Alexandra's sister, Dagmar, married Emperor Alexander III 3 years later and became Maria Fyodorovna, the mother of Nicholas II. So, yes, Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra Fyodorovna were fourth cousins. Before you get completely tangled up, let's return to Britain. Victoria's choice initially seemed perfect. When Bertie was introduced to Alexandra, he liked her a lot. The young man wasn't opposed to the union either. But such an idyll couldn't last long. By the 4th year of marriage, by 1867, Bertie no longer cared about his wife. Alexandra had given birth to 2 children and was pregnant with a third. In her 8th month, she fell seriously ill. The heir to the British throne refused to visit her. He was too busy sleeping with a courtesan in another city. To escape the prying press, Bertie began living in France, in Paris. There, he could revel to his heart's content. He practically lived in local brothels, with not just a VIP room, but a personal bedroom and bathroom. Alexandra was a woman of great patience. She believed she was the only one who truly loved Albert Edward. Alas, she was mistaken. At some point, Bertie fell in love with Harriet Mordaunt, the wife of a British baronet. The future king constantly visited her while her husband was away, sometimes straight from the brothel. But one day, Bertie was caught red-handed by the husband, no less like in a bad joke. The story leaked to the press, becoming a massive problem. Don't underestimate the 19th century media. Even then, they were a full-fledged fourth estate. As philosopher Edmund Burke said, most of the urban population, especially the wealthy and influential, avidly read newspapers. Now imagine what they printed, all the future king's dirty laundry, on the level of a Twitter sex scandal. Did Bertie learn his lesson and become more discreet? Hardly. After the scandal, his name was linked to numerous actresses, including Sarah Bernhardt and members of high society. Bertie's final mistress was Alice Keppel, a beautiful, naturally married aristocrat. When they met, she was 28 and he was 56. Despite the age difference, she managed to bring Victoria's son under control. They were a perfect match, gossiping about the aristocracy, discussing politics and the financial market. It seems the only thing she didn't share was his love for horse racing. In short, a complete match. Alice didn't forget about the king's wife either. As a dutiful husband, Bertie, along with his mistress, picked out gifts for Alexandra, like Faberge animal figurines made from mural gemstones, seals, and rabbits, not just the famous eggs. Alexandra came to terms with it and even befriended her husband's mistress. By 1901, Bertie was 59 and still a prince. During a church service, he openly said he was tired of being the only person in the country suffering from his mother's immortality. He didn't have to wait long. That same year, Queen Victoria died, and the playboy Bertie became King Edward VII of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Fate would grant him only 9 years of rule. But what years they were. In his late 60s, Edward got his act together and began wielding the limited powers a monarch had under a strong parliament. His lively and spirited character proved useful in foreign policy. The king improved relations with Britain's main continental partner, France, and with Russia. This was a revelation. Russia and Britain had been at odds throughout the 19th century, starting with the Napoleonic Wars. No one in Russia could forget the disastrous outcome of the Crimean War. But in 1907, Edward and Nicholas II signed the Anglo-Russian Entente. Why does this matter? It created the Entente as we know it, the alliance of Britain, France, and Russia. And it was possible thanks to Edward. In his personal life, he was quite a character, but in foreign policy, he was remarkably active and productive. His mother was long called the grandmother of Europe, but in just a few years, Edward earned the title of Uncle of the Continent, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but beloved nonetheless. Perhaps because this uncle lived not on the continent but on an island? And despite everything, he was considered influential. The king died on May 6, 1910. Feeling chest pain, he lay down to rest. The last thing he learned was that he'd won money on a horse race. The reveler, gambler, and charming diplomat managed to say, "Very glad." He was 68. His son George, Elizabeth II's grandfather, wrote in his diary that day, "I have lost my best friend and the best of fathers." He wrote it and became King George V of the House of Windsor. George VI had an older brother, Eddie. So we need to explain why he didn't become king. Albert Victor, known as Eddie, didn't become king despite being the eldest. He grew up frail, shy, and utterly apathetic. In his school years, his grandmother Victoria assigned someone to raise him as harshly as they'd tried with Bertie. But the crown had no luck here either. Teachers delicately called Eddie's mind abnormally dormant. If his father refused to study out of defiance, Eddie simply couldn't grasp the material. As the heir grew older, new concerns arose. In July 1889, London police raided an underground brothel in Fitzrovia, near Soho. This wasn't an ordinary brothel. Sodomy was a criminal offense in Britain at the time. Interrogations revealed that it wasn't just working-class men frequenting the place, but the cream of the aristocracy, sons of dukes, earls, and, as you might guess, the heir to the throne. This was a nightmare for the royal court, the worst kind of scandal. And the brothel incident wasn't the end of it. Late 19th century London was a grim place. The city was shrouded in coal smog, and people struggled to make ends meet. Meanwhile, droves of people from the regions poured into the overcrowded capital. They settled in the outskirts, which quickly turned into social ghettos. One such area was Whitechapel. It was in Whitechapel that the Ripper may have killed up to 20 people. Who the Ripper was, or if he even existed, remains unclear. But what if his identity was concealed by powerful patrons? This gave rise to a conspiracy theory. Jack the Ripper was the heir to the British throne. Rumors suggested that Eddie's escapades in Whitechapel resulted in a bastard child, and either he or someone acting on his orders killed women there to cover it up. It's a gripping story, but as often happens with conspiracies, it's gripping nonsense. The prince had a solid alibi for the time of 2 confirmed murders. He was in Scotland and physically couldn't have been involved, at least personally. Eddie's story is short. He died in January 1892 from influenza, not even reaching 30. The royal authorities were initially dismayed, but soon no one at court hid that the death of the potential heir was, to quote, an act of divine mercy. Thus, George, Elizabeth II's grandfather, became the heir. He would become George V in 1910. George was calm, balanced, and phlegmatic. He served successfully in the Navy, without much favoritism. He scrubbed decks, fought for respect among peers, and treated ordinary sailors as equals. Most importantly, he adored his grandmother, Queen Victoria. It's a story reminiscent of Catherine II, her unloved son Paul, and her beloved grandson Alexander. When George ascended the throne, he pursued policies similar to those of his beloved grandmother. On the personal front, he was a fortress, no affairs, immense respect for his wife, even consulting her on state matters. If the previous king resembled a parody of a Bourbon Sun king, George changed everything. No debauchery, just homey comfort, black tea, and soft leather slippers. If he traveled abroad, it was only to visit relatives, like his cousin Nicholas II in Russia. Not only did they look like twins, take a look, you can't tell them apart, but they shared the same interests. In 1893, George wrote to Nicholas, "I consider you my oldest and most loyal friend." History would show, however, that his words weren't worth a penny. In 1918, when Nicholas and his family faced danger after the Revolution, George refused to grant him asylum in England. Sorry, brother, but what if anti-monarchist unrest starts in Britain? And if British monarchs support them, how are we any better? But that was later. In 1914, World War I began, Germany and Austria-Hungary against Russia, France, Britain, and Serbia. It was the largest conflict in world history at the time. For centuries, Europeans didn't care that their rulers were foreigners. It didn't matter that the elite spoke French or German while commoners used some odd peasant dialect that wasn't even an official language. That was the norm until the 19th century broke everything. National romanticism, self-awareness, and a sense of being part of a unified cultural whole, rather than just subjects of a king, changed the game. If Britain was at war with Germany, it meant Britons were fighting Germans. No other way about it. This trend didn't spare us either. The renaming of St. Petersburg to Petrograd, anti-German pogroms, rumors of the Empress's German ties, despite her being more English than German, it all happened in Britain too. Stuffy gentlemen sipped tea at 5 o'clock, then went to burn down Bavarian butcher shops, sometimes with people inside, locking the doors tight. It reached absurd levels. The British public turned against dachshunds. In the West, these eared sausages were a symbol of Germany, much like bulldogs were for Britain. Dachshunds appeared in caricatures as the embodiment of the German people. The most unhinged individuals attacked dachshunds and their owners. Now, recall the lineage of King George. See the problem? The king understood perfectly. If the public was ready to kill dogs for seeming German, what would happen if they remembered his 70% German blood and decided his name wasn't George but George? So, the monarch pulled a clever move. He took the war as a personal challenge. He needed to become a symbol of the nation to unite it against the enemy. He constantly visited hospitals and sat under bombardments. And guess what the German bomber planes were called? Gotha, after the city where they were made. Germany was dropping Gotha bombs on the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha dynasty. On June 17, 1917, George V signed a fateful document. The Saxe-Coburg and Gotha dynasty was no more. Now there were only the Windsors, named after Windsor Castle, the official residence of monarchs, a worthy 11th century fortress built by William the Conqueror. Alongside the Tower of London, it's a symbol of English monarchy. A rebranding worthy of a true patriot. Now he and his family were English to the core, or at least that's how the newly minted Windsors wanted to appear. A year later, the war ended. For monarchies, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman were destroyed. But George escaped this curse. He understood well that a populist backlash could shake his throne too. So he embarked on another rebranding. He tucked away the Victorian gentleman's attire even further and became a common man who, well, sometimes wore a crown. An elephant among aristocrats. He didn't have to act much, this was his authentic self. George quickly built ties with Britain's leftists. He negotiated with union leaders. During the 1926 general strike, he personally forbade using force against protesters, telling Prime Minister Baldwin, "Try living on their wages before you judge them." Finally, he overcame royal conservatism in technology. He hated radio, but still delivered a Christmas address to the nation in 1932, with the text written by Rudyard Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book. Despite his starkly different character from his father, George V won the people's love. But in focusing on his career, he overlooked something crucial: his children. 1936. The world is hurtling toward another global war. The Great Depression, starting in 1929 in the US, swept through the world like a tornado. Economies collapsed like soap bubbles. In Germany, the Nazis rose to power. We covered this in a recent video. France was shaken. In 1934, a right-wing revolution nearly succeeded, but was quashed. In the Soviet Union, the most intense and tragic purges, both within and outside the party, were beginning. What about Britain? The Windsors somehow kept things relatively calm. The Great Depression hit, but not as hard as in Germany, the US, or France. Yes, the gold standard was abandoned. Yes, Ireland was let go. But the disillusionment with power that other countries faced didn't grip Britain. On the throne was still George V, a towering figure and symbol of an older era. The monarchy had lost much of its power since the early 20th century. More precisely, it wasn't that monarchs were stripped of rights, but they stopped using them under pressure from other institutions. For example, the royal veto, last used in 1829. In theory, when Ireland sought self-governance in 1914, George could have used the veto, but everyone would have seen him as eccentric. It was under George V, not Elizabeth II, that the British monarchy finally transitioned from a governing tool to a tradition. This was an incredibly tough shift. Where people gain the right to elect their leaders, a monarch faces two fates: either be exiled with their family, as happened in most European countries, or worse, executed with their children, or be allowed to exist for its own sake. Professor Mats Erd of the Stockholm School of Economics calls modern European monarchies, stripped of governing functions, brands. The monarch in this structure is a lifelong CEO or an honorary president. The subjects are simply a loyal audience. Keep this corporate analogy in mind, it'll come up again. In this setup, the monarch takes on a vital symbolic role. Presidents and prime ministers come and go, parliaments face crises and scandals. But monarchs in such countries are there for life. They become a linchpin to lean on during political upheavals. They're no longer a symbol of usurped power to be overthrown, but a backbone preserving historical tradition, like a corset, a popular feature at royal balls. A queen or emperor becomes a kindly uncle you don't personally know but deeply respect. Especially since this uncle's passport and credit cards have been taken away and his house is bugged. National identity and patriotism were fresh concepts in the 20th century. But loyalty to a monarch is ancient, not easily tucked away in history's dusty trunk. That's why monarchies are respected today. Any divorce, marriage, or death in the royal family becomes news everyone discusses. The royal family's private life ceases to be private. They live in a fishbowl, like the reality show Big Brother. Remember the buzz around it in 2001, when people were placed in a space where anyone could watch them. It's the same here. Monarchs live in a spacious, luxurious, comfortable fishbowl. When the elderly King George V died in January 1936, the Windsors faced trouble again. Let's look at the family tree. George had 6 children, 5 of them boys. We're interested in the 2 eldest, Edward and Albert. They weren't very creative with names. Let's start with Edward. From childhood, he was raised by nannies, but there were clearly issues with the palace's HR department. His nanny humiliated and even hit him. His parents, seeing his tearful face, sent him back to the nanny to pull himself together. The boy excelled academically, spoke languages, and rode horses well. But society would remember him for something else. Everyone adored him for his beauty. From childhood, he earned the nickname Prince Charming. Spot on, like the character from Shrek. He became a true sex symbol of his era. From his youth, he had countless admirers and took full advantage of it. He avoided scandals as sordid as his grandfather's. He remained a romantic hero at court, having affairs and falling in love, but never marrying. By 1930, at 36, he was still single. This sparked conflict with his father, George. Edward thought court etiquette was a farce. He said, "I'd rather be killed than become like my father." King George reciprocated. He believed his son behaved unworthily of a future ruler. Once, George prophetically said, "The boy will ruin himself within 12 months." In January 1936, the eldest son became Edward VIII and ascended the throne. Or did he? Here we need to talk about his chosen one, Wallis Simpson. Wallis was an American who hit the jackpot. Born into a wealthy family, she then married English aristocrat Ernest Simpson, landing not just in Britain but in high society. There, she met her Prince Charming. At their first meeting, she managed to be rude to him. That must have hooked him. From that moment, a romance began between the British prince and a married American unheard of. But the romance was doomed. When the unmarried Edward became king, continuing with Wallis became pointless. Here's why. The king is not just a secular figure, but a spiritual one. Upon ascending the throne, he becomes the head of the Church of England. Such a person cannot marry a divorced woman. And Wallis Simpson was not only divorced, but currently married. To be with the new king, she'd have to divorce again. Moreover, we now know Simpson was also involved with 2 other men at the time, one being diplomat and future Nazi foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. We'll come back to that. Edward was trapped. On one hand, he had to become king and continue the Windsor dynasty. On the other, he had great love. At 41, was this his last chance? Combining the two was impossible without plunging the country into a political crisis, especially with a new world war looming. It was a stalemate. The British government didn't mince words. "Dear King Edward, marry Simpson, and we all resign." There was little dissent in their ranks, except for 2 political has-beens, former Prime Minister Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, who'd been without a government post for 7 years and was considered untouchable even in his own party. Plus, he already saw Hitler as a major threat, long before the well-known events. Edward faced a choice, his beloved or the crown. The second Windsor king chose love. On December 10th, 1936, Edward VIII declared, "I cannot carry out the duties of king as I would wish without the help and support of the woman I love." He abdicated, having sat on the throne for less than a year, just as his father predicted. The younger brother, Albert, became King George VI, and his daughter Elizabeth, with whom we began this episode, became the heir to the throne. Usually, Edward's story ends here. But that's a mistake. What happened in his life afterward is even more shocking. After his marriage saga, he became a free man, married Wallis, and together they traveled to Nazi Germany. The former British king personally met Hitler, and the Times wrote, "His Royal Highness smiles and salutes the Nazi way to the crowd gathered under his hotel windows." This was during the height of appeasement policy. When the war began, rumors swirled that if the Nazis succeeded and Britain capitulated, the throne would be handed back to Edward as a Nazi puppet. It was more complicated. Like many of his generation, Edward feared another war. During World War I, he served in the army, and though he wasn't sent to the front, He saw the horrors of war firsthand and didn't want them repeated. After the war began, Edward and his wife moved first to fascist Spain, then to neutral Portugal. From there, he clumsily called for peace. This didn't sit well with Churchill, a staunch advocate of fighting to the end. He threatened to send the Windsors to a military tribunal if they continued. A compromise was apparently reached. In August 1940, Edward and Wallace left Lisbon for the Bahamas, where he became the honorary governor. He wasn't thrilled about it, calling the islands a third-rate British colony. But he worked sincerely, doing much for the region, including fighting discrimination against black people, an unexpected move for an alleged Nazi. Still, Edward repeatedly expressed pro-Nazi views, calling Hitler the right and logical leader of the German people and blaming everyone but the main Nazi for the war. To silence a royal family member, British intelligence released archives of Edward's correspondence with Hitler at the war's end. The compromising material was likely serious, as he fell silent. With the war over, there was no need to keep the former Nazi sympathizer in the Bahamas. He was allowed to return to Europe. He began a new life in Paris, a typical choice for his family. Over time, he reconciled with his family, and even his wife was eventually accepted at the family table. Time heals, as they say. But none of this might have happened without his younger brother, a frail, sickly man, but one devoted to duty, George VI. Thanks to the film The King's Speech, millions worldwide learned that Britain had a stuttering king. The future George VI was left-handed. As a child, he was painfully struck on the hands and forced to write with his right. Combined with stomach and knee problems, this led to constant tantrums. That's likely when his stutter developed. The boy grew up, served in the Navy and Air Force as expected, and it was time to choose a wife. His genes kicked in. Like his brother Edward, he courted a married Australian actress, Sheila Chisholm. But his father, George V, found out and told him to stop. Here, the future king showed how he differed from his wayward older brother. When told to stop, he did. Family demanded, he obeyed. His father greatly respected this obedience and loyalty. This raises a question. When did the era of dynastic marriages end? Not long ago, partners were chosen strategically to keep the family influential and preferably royal. Now, people dated whomever they wanted. That era ended with great-grandmother Victoria, especially after World War I. No ruling dynasties, no dynastic marriages. It's that simple. A historical brand without any real power is worthless. Yet some old traditions persisted. You already know about the ban on marrying divorcees. Also, royal family members couldn't marry without the monarch's consent. No marriages to Catholics either, a strict rule from the 17th century to prevent Catholics from regaining power in Britain. Finally, potential brides were expected to be virgins. Today, mentioning this rule feels awkward, and it's unclear if it mattered much in George V's time. When the future king married a worthy aristocrat, he proved to be a good father too. Unlike his father, grandfather, and great-grandmother, he didn't neglect his children, but loved and tried to please them. Many know Elizabeth II loved dogs, especially corgis, the noblest of breeds. That came from her father. George adored corgis and passed that love to his daughter. But George had another, destructive love, smoking. He picked up the habit in university. A story goes that when a teacher caught him with a cigarette and asked, "What will your family think if they find out you smoke?" the young prince replied, "We're not a family, we're a firm." If this isn't a screenwriter's invention, it was a prophetic phrase. In 1936, the sickly, melancholic, dutiful son and loving father became king. When your nickname is Lucky, he first tried to personally appease Hitler, a failure. When the war began, he, like his father, aimed to become a national symbol, visiting the front, meeting bombing victims. Once, a bomb even hit Buckingham Palace's lawn, and the royal family was delighted. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, said she could now look the East End in the eye, the London district hit hardest by German strikes. Finally, the king overcame his stutter. Before the war, he hired an Australian speech therapist. The king, who once couldn't string two words together in public, learned to speak clearly. The film The King's Speech, though not entirely historically accurate, vividly shows this. After May 1945, George VI was hailed as the King of Victory, like his father 27 years earlier. The people adored this Windsor, but victory came at a heavy cost for Britain. Even Churchill lost the 1945 parliamentary elections to Labour. The British Empire was dying, and Hitler's surrender couldn't delay it. The country's losses were relatively low, 380,000 people. But the economy was in ruins, most gold reserves were depleted, and the national debt to GDP ratio jumped from 130% to 275%. Britain took loans from the US and Canada worth $90 billion in today's money, only paying them off 18 years ago. The Labour government, now in power, tried to seize and redistribute, but there was nothing to share. The country entered austerity. From 1947, some foods were rationed: 1 egg, a liter of milk, 45 grams of cheese, and 400 grams of meat per person per week. Meanwhile, Britain's colonies and dominions sensed the lion's grip weakening, fueling nationalist movements. In 1947, Britain lost its crown jewel, India, followed by Ceylon, now Sri Lanka and Myanmar. Then came Palestine, Libya, and Oman. Unwilling to maintain colonies and protectorates, Britain let them go. The king could do nothing, even if he wanted to.
After the war, George's health declined sharply. The war took a heavy toll, compounded by his constant smoking and frail constitution. In September 1951, one of his lungs was removed, but it didn't save him. 6 months later, he died of coronary thrombosis at 56. His beloved eldest daughter was on a Commonwealth tour.
When she left, she was the Duchess of Edinburgh. She returned as Queen Elizabeth II. Elizabeth was born in 1926, and from early childhood, she drew special attention. When Churchill saw her at 2 years old, he said she had a thoughtful and commanding gaze. She was raised not only by her parents, but also by other relatives. Her grandfather, King George V, whom she called Grandpa England, adored her. From her father and grandfather, she absorbed a key principle, a la Dominic Toretto: nothing is more important than family. Young Elizabeth loved learning. Like previous Windsors, this happened at home, or rather, in the palace. History and languages were her forte. One detail: while most princes attended universities, Elizabeth never did. Compare, Elizabeth had lessons from 9:30 to 11 a.m., then spent the rest of the day on active recreation or studying dance. Male heirs were taught from 7 to 8 a.m. to 6 to 7 p.m. It was thought she needed only a standard home education without excess. For any adult, this detail might seem minor, but not when you're the Queen of Britain. Her lack of a degree was thrown in her face in 2003 when she was 77. At an exhibition organized by historian David Starkey, she seemed bored and at one point complained, "Why haven't they brought my favorite gin cocktail yet?" Starkey snapped, "Who let this yokel in?" He called Elizabeth an uneducated housewife lacking cultural refinement. By the mid-20th century, media scrutiny was relentless. Unlike the early century, with no radio or TV, Elizabeth couldn't take a step without public attention. In 1951, she toured Canada and the US, and the Western world buzzed about it. Americans, eager to cash in on the hype, considered publishing a book about Elizabeth's childhood, but the royal court firmly refused. The princess's life was shrouded in secrecy. Then they approached a woman who had been governess to both princesses, Elizabeth and her sister Margaret. By then retired, but still close to the court, she wrote The Little Princesses, spilling drawers of royal dirty laundry. From it, we learned that King George VI wasn't always so sweet. Queen Mother Elizabeth despised the other Windsors, and both Elizabeth II and Margaret were poorly educated. After this, the former governess was evicted from the Kensington home gifted to her. The Windsors saw it as betrayal. Back to Elizabeth. In 1934, at 8 years old, she visited the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth with her family. There, a 13-year-old boy named Philip was studying. Philip wasn't just any boy. He was the son of a Greek prince from the German house of Glucksburg. His grandmother was Grand Duchess Olga Konstantinovna, Nicholas I's granddaughter. On his father's side, he could claim the Danish throne. When he and Elizabeth grew close, her father disapproved. King George considered Philip a poor match for his daughter, but he didn't protest strongly, though he had grounds. Philip's 4 sisters all married Germans, 2 of whom joined the Nazi Party and 2 were even in the SS. Still, this didn't stop them. In 1947, Elizabeth and Philip married. Their marriage was happy, though not entirely perfect. When it was decided their children would take their mother's dynastic name, Windsor, Philip was upset. His adopted British surname was Mountbatten. As we know, German names like Glucksburg and Battenberg fell out of favor after World War I. So, the Mountbattens were consigned to history's dustbin. Their children with Elizabeth, including Charles, couldn't bear that name. I know you're probably tired of these genealogical adventures, but this is a critical detail we'll revisit at the story's climax. Now, let's look at the country Elizabeth II inherited. Losing India and Palestine wasn't a fatal blow. It stung, a hit to prestige, but Britain's belief in itself as a great power remained. The real cold shower for both Britain and France came in 1956, the Suez Crisis. The canal linking the Mediterranean and Red Seas was nationalized. By old habit, France and Britain tried to put their former colony in its place, but failed, not militarily, as the operation was successful, but diplomatically. By then, the world was split into pro-Soviet and pro-Western camps. In the Euro-Anglo-American Cold War bloc, London was a highly influential player. But neither the US nor the USSR respected the colonial system, including Britain's, which was on its last legs. Elizabeth inherited an aging, weakened empire. It was formally respected, valued, and remembered for its nuclear arsenal. Britain got the bomb after the US and USSR. But London's interests were often ignored. Even in her own palace, Elizabeth's opinions were frequently disregarded, especially by her younger sister, Margaret. While Elizabeth built the image of an ideal queen, her sister flouted the court's conservative customs. The court was already a mess in that regard. Margaret partied with married men. Her most notable affair was with RAF Captain Peter Townsend. She started drinking. At 15, Margaret reveled in pleasure and luxury, a typical golden youth, and the public adored her. It was the 1950s, and people thought differently. Margaret set trends for luxury and revelry. Young people wanted to live like her, keeping her on newspaper and magazine covers. She later married, but couldn't shake her image. To the media, she remained a frivolous girl. They dwelled on rumors of her alcoholism, other addictions, and health issues, which long damaged the monarchy's prestige. But the Windsors' real trials were still ahead. Finally, we reach the most famous, tragic, and controversial page in their history, Princess Diana. Princess Diana never became queen, but she was called the Queen of Hearts. She was like Michael Jordan or Michael Jackson. She became a media star when the internet wasn't yet widespread, but television was everywhere. A star far away yet closer than before, beaming into every home on kitchen or living room screens. The image of the Princess of Wales is shrouded in dozens of myths, as if every stereotype converged. But separating truth from fiction isn't as hard as 150 years ago. In brief, Diana was born on the Sandringham Palace estate. She married Prince Charles, Elizabeth II's son, now King of Britain. The marriage was unhappy, but Diana became a public favorite, especially among girls and women worldwide. Why? She was the only royal who constantly engaged with the press. In interviews, Diana said she'd likely never be queen, but dreamed of being the queen of people's hearts. Her phenomenal popularity became a problem for the court. Rumors claim that after Diana and Charles divorced, Elizabeth II said no second Diana could be allowed in the family. She was so beloved in Britain and globally that she overshadowed the entire royal family. No single person could outshine all the Windsors. To understand Diana's position, Let's recall her ex-husband, now King Charles III. Charles was a first in many ways. As mentioned, he was the first Windsor to attend a public school, Hill House, rather than home education. He was forced to be closer to the people, with predictably opposite results. The heir-loathed school, becoming an introverted history nerd. To me, he sounds fine. Another anomaly, he went straight to university, skipping the customary Windsor military service. There, he continued studying history and romanced various high society women, daughters of a British ambassador to Spain, a duke, and his future wife Camilla, granddaughter of Baron Ashcombe. Why did Diana tilt her head or curtsy in photos with her husband? The open secret is that Charles was self-conscious about his height. Diana, especially in heels, was taller. By status, they were, if not equal, at least not far apart. Diana's Cinderella story is a beautiful myth. Cinderellas aren't born in palaces, in an earl's family with a lady-in-waiting mother close to the royals. She was considered a Cinderella not because her family was poor, but because she was an utterly foreign element to the Windsors. In the early 1980s, with a charming young woman on one side and a prince, not exactly charming, with questionable qualities and a powerful, sometimes cunning family behind him, it's no surprise whose side society took. Eagerly watching the latest round of royal marital intrigues. Charles initially courted not Diana, but her sister Sarah. They had a brief romance, and she spent a weekend at the Royal Balmoral Castle. But she seemed too indiscreet, and the relationship ended. 3 years later, Charles connected with Diana. Their courtship was short and vibrant. For their engagement, Charles gave Diana a ring with a blue sapphire, instantly iconic. In 1981, they married, and Diana became the Princess of Wales. The lavish wedding, costing $115 million, nearly $500 million in today's dollars, was Britain's most expensive. But soon, the world saw what lay behind the glamorous facade. The couple's relationship was rocky. They clashed in character and argued constantly. The Queen and her husband Philip tried to reconcile them, but letters, pleas, and heartfelt talks had no effect. Their 2 sons, William and Harry, didn't save the marriage. Instead, they fueled further conflict, not just between Diana and Charles, but with the entire royal family. Diana loved children, not just her own, but all children. In her youth, she worked as a nanny in London's elite kindergartens and for wealthy families. She frequently appeared in public with children, holding them and posing for sweet photos. It's hard to accuse her of faking it. She was a deeply involved mother. She personally chose her son's schools, took them to classes when her schedule allowed, and understood their schools couldn't be like the Swiss boarding school she'd fled back to London. The main drama of Diana's life was Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Spoiler, they're still together, and she's now queen instead of Elizabeth II. But the tabloids didn't just cover Charles and Camilla, they also reported on Diana's affairs. In 1992, The Sun published leaks of Diana's conversations with one of her lovers. This sparked a fierce media war between the prince and princess. Each tried to clear their name while slinging mud at the other. These feuds dragged the crown's reputation to rock bottom. In 1992, Diana contacted Andrew Morton, then a little-known court correspondent. He began preparing her biography, Diana, Her True Story. It tore the country apart like a Union Jack. Diana exposed the royal family's dirty laundry, Charles's affair with Camilla, court officials' intrigues. The world learned that when Charles saw his son was born red-haired, he was disappointed. Why another son, and a redhead at that? Likely a jab at the Irish. When the book came out, the royal court tried to dismiss it as journalistic fiction. We now know most of it was true. But that wasn't enough for Diana. In November 1995, she gave another explosive interview, pulling no punches. She spoke again about Charles's affair and famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." Diana publicly declared she didn't believe Charles would be a good king. She also shared personal struggles, how his behavior harmed her health, led to depression, and other heavy issues. It was an informational bombshell. Elizabeth could no longer tolerate her scandalous daughter-in-law. She asked Charles and Diana to divorce. They were only too happy to comply. Diana felt fully justified and did much to ruin the future king's reputation. Neither before nor after Diana did Buckingham Palace face such a fiasco. Perhaps, over time, Diana's martyr image, pitted against the evil Windsors, might have faded. But tragedy struck. In 1997, she died in a Paris car crash with Dodi Al-Fayed. Her death is one of the 20th century's most conspiratorial stories. Theories abound: a faulty car, a drunk driver, an attempt to escape paparazzi. Dodi's father, Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al-Fayed, was convinced British intelligence orchestrated the crash. Former MI6 officer Richard Tomlinson claimed under oath that one of Diana's bodyguards was an intelligence operative and the crash was staged using a strobe light to blind the driver. None of these theories have been substantiated with solid evidence. Diana's reputation could be debated endlessly, but this isn't a gossip channel. We can say one thing for certain: Diana was not only the Queen of Hearts, but also of PR. In public, she was charming, approachable, and open, in stark contrast to the secretive, stuffy, outdated royal court. The collective Buckingham Palace lost spectacularly to one vibrant woman with nothing to hide. Equally important, Charles and Camilla were never forgiven for Diana's death. The 1990s were a different era. George V and even Elizabeth II could maintain a private, respectable image. That no longer worked. The audience for gossip had also changed. In the Victorian era, a king's romantic escapades were elite rumors. Edward VI's personal life stayed in newspapers. But Diana and Charles's scandals were followed globally. The royal dynasty survived Diana's scandal, but seems to have learned nothing, and that's clearest now. The Windsors successfully entered the 21st century. Old problems, old solutions. They outlasted most European dynasties, the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, our beloved Habsburgs. But something changed. The old British way of life is gone. George VI's quip about the dynasty as a corporation became reality. They can't live otherwise. To keep reigning, they need a team of experts managing traditions, finances, and, of course, their health. What do we know about their assets? The Windsors are incredibly wealthy. In 2017, their assets were worth $113 billion in today's terms. That's just shy of the top 10 richest people globally, surpassing Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg. Let's count: 7 palaces, 10 castles, 12 houses, 56 cottages, and 14 ancient ruins, just for good measure. The Crown Estate manages all these assets. Here's the clever part: the monarchy doesn't keep all profits from its properties, only a quarter. Their income for 2021 was £88 million. That's often presented as the cost of maintaining the monarchy, not much for a 1,000-year institution. But that's not entirely accurate. The real cost is higher: security, travel budgets, income from the royal duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster. Total expenses reach £345 million. Quite a difference. But here's the kicker: the Crown recoups most of this and even turns a profit. In the pandemic year of 2021, taxes from the dynasty and tourism tied to its assets brought £263 million to the treasury. So, we can't say the royal court is a burden on taxpayers. But the family became a heavy burden for the king's younger son, Harry. Both brothers had a tough childhood, their parents' conflicts, a painful divorce, their mother's death. The brothers walked behind her coffin in the funeral procession to Westminster Abbey. Their long-standing resentment toward the press intensified. They blamed paparazzi for their mother's death. Harry was born with the stigma of always being second. William's path is clear. He'll eventually be king. Harry's fate is predetermined, a lifelong B-lister. His biggest scandal came in 2005. Harry, a citizen of Britain, which was relentlessly bombed by the Luftwaffe in the 1940s, attended a party in a Nazi costume. All hell broke loose when he began dating American Meghan Markle. The British media hounded her for everything: a poor dress choice, her nationality. It wasn't just her mixed heritage. Britain understood that. What infuriated them was her being American, another Wallis Simpson. The spiral of history is an unscientific term, but how can you ignore that British royals, as if following a script, fall into the same scandals a century apart? But the Crown's PR team had a bigger problem: the king's younger brother, Andrew. It started innocently. In 2001, Prince Andrew was appointed Special Representative for International Trade, a largely ceremonial role, traveling to foster economic ties. How could you mess that up? Andrew managed. He actively promoted a private bank owned by his best friend's family at official meetings. Worse, they co-owned an offshore company, whose interests he also quietly advanced. He was accused of corruption. It got worse. Andrew was criticized for close ties with Muammar Gaddafi's son. Britain's relations with Libya's ruler were terrible. How could they not be when his people deliberately blew up a plane over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 259 on board and 11 on the ground? Gaddafi later admitted Libya's responsibility. And, for a surprising twist, the son of the British Queen was named among those who visited Jeffrey Epstein's island, where, according to several sources, some very troubling activities took place. 10 years ago, a young woman who experienced abuse on the island shared her story, stating that Andrew mistreated her 3 times when she was still a minor under 18. In response, 94-year-old Elizabeth II, shortly before her death, stripped her son of military titles and the right to represent the crown in charity. This Windsor never went to prison. In February of that year, Andrew paid the victim an undisclosed settlement. By the standards of other dynasties, our tour of the Windsors was brief, just 150 years. You may have noticed this episode focused less on history and more on personal lives than usual. This isn't just because the Windsor story is ongoing, with many events too recent to assess their long-term impact. The key point is that the British monarchy's significance has dwindled. Especially after World War II, it went from a unifying national symbol to a late-season Big Brother with an exorbitantly expensive set. What future awaits the Windsors? The question itself contains an error because the Windsors, as such, no longer exist. This isn't fiction or madness. Let's rewind and recall how the Windsors, Coburgs, and Gothas came to power. Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, a German, and the dynasty passed through the father. We knew that. But when did they stop being Windsors? Let's keep going. Philip, Elizabeth's husband, took the British surname Mountbatten to downplay his German Glucksburg roots. Logically, all their children, including Charles, should be Mountbattens. Remember the story of Philip's frustration that his children wouldn't bear his surname? This issue arose because Winston Churchill pushed to retain the Windsor name, and Elizabeth agreed. But to avoid completely upsetting her husband, 65 years ago she signed an agreement. All descendants of their marriage through the male line, without high titles, would carry the double surname Mountbatten-Windsor. It was a clever arrangement. Children unlikely to inherit the throne got the double name, while those with a shot, like Charles III, remained Windsors. But even this was true only on paper. British kings or queens don't have surnames. They're addressed as Your Majesty. You might say, so what? Why discuss this at the end? What's this nonsense with surnames? Where does it end? But it turns out the Windsors are just a dynastic label for convenience. Imagine a company, a legal entity. It's founded by certain people, then, through a deal, the founders, top management, and board change, but the company's name stays the same. Something similar happened here. So, the reigning British dynasty called the Windsors isn't quite the Windsors. Dig just a bit deeper, and they're not even Windsors but Glucksburgs. The Windsors, whose British name was a product of political expediency, are no longer on the throne. What future awaits this monarchy? Elizabeth II was a cult figure, bridging the past and present, the 20th and 21st centuries. Even monarchy opponents valued and respected her. Today, things are different. For years, it was believed tradition, the monarchy, and the British mentality, which shuns radicalism, would save the country. Now, in an era of political populism, disillusionment with state institutions grows faster than usual, and the Windsors' future is foggy, even by British standards. A poll last year showed the monarchy's approval rating at a historic low. Only a third of society considers it an important institution. 45% support its abolition or deny its significance. If someone holds a referendum on the monarchy's fate, there's a good chance the royal family will need to find a new home, and Britain will become a republic. Over 124 years, the Windsors survived 2 world wars and the British Empire's collapse, becoming the oldest state company, renowned for its traditions but little else. Monarchs no longer govern, bureaucrats and institutions do. The Windsors constantly tried to hide a simple fact through censorship. They're ordinary people with virtues, flaws, vices, and fears. Their conservative shell looks odd today. Imagine how it'll look in 50 years. Will we witness the fall of another royal dynasty in our lifetime? A fascinating question I don't yet have an answer for. If you enjoyed learning about the Windsors and want more in our series on great dynasties, like this video and share it with your friends, family, and colleagues.